The men on the range laughed before she even raised the rifle. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, the laughing. How easy it came, how certain they were that they already knew the ending. Sergeant Kellner had organized the challenge as a joke. That much was understood by everyone present, though no one would admit it later. After the results came in and the paperwork had to be filed, and Commander Ashford had to decide what exactly to put in the report. Her name was Linden Vael. She was 29 years old, and she had transferred into the Joint Task Force 2 assessment program from a signals intelligence unit in Ottawa that most of the men on that range had never heard of. She arrived on a Tuesday in late October, carrying a regulation kit bag and a rifle case that was slightly too long to be standard issue. Nobody asked about the case. They should have. The range at CFB Gagetown stretches north toward a tree line of white spruce and balsam fir that closes in on clear days like a dark wall at the edge of everything. It was cold that morning, the kind of cold that settles into southwestern New Brunswick in autumn without announcing itself. Not bitter, not dramatic, just permanent. The frost had not lifted off the grass by the time the assessment group assembled at 0700. 11 candidates, 10 men, 1 woman. The imbalance was not unusual for JTF2 selections. It was, in fact, still considered unremarkable. Linden Vael stood third from the left and said nothing while Sergeant Kellner walked the line. He was a compact man with a face like compressed patience, and he had been running selection assessments for 6 years. He had seen candidates arrive with credentials that dissolved under pressure. He had seen quiet ones surprise him. He believed, and had said so on more than one occasion in the mess, that the quiet ones were usually quiet for a reason. Either they had nothing worth saying, or they had already decided that words were a poor use of the available time. He had not yet determined which category Vael fell into. He planned to find out. The first 3 events were standard: timed runs, load carry, obstacle navigation in low visibility conditions. Vael completed each without comment and without distinction. She was not the fastest, not the slowest, placed comfortably in the middle of the group in a way that suggested either careful conservation of effort or natural limitation. Kellner noted her times. He noted also that she never looked at the other candidates when she finished. She looked north, at the tree line. He found this mildly interesting and then forgot about it. The 4th event was the range assessment. This was where the laughter started. The targets had been set at 400 meters for the first stage, which was routine. 600 for the second, 800 for the third, which thinned out most candidate groups considerably. The 4th stage, rarely reached during standard assessment, included almost as formality, was set at 1100 meters in a light crosswind that had picked up from the northwest around 0930, gusting irregular, the kind of wind that punishes assumptions and rewards patience. Sergeant Kellner explained the 4th stage briefly and without ceremony. He mentioned it the way a person mentions a door at the back of a room that is almost certainly locked. Candidate Harwick, who had placed first in the load carry and second in the obstacle course, asked whether the 4th stage was mandatory. Kellner said it was available to any candidate who reached it. Candidate Harwick nodded. He had a competitive record from his previous posting and a certainty about him that took up space. He was the kind of soldier who succeeded through application of force, not cruelty, but volume, output, refusal to stop. This approach worked for most things. It worked less well for problems that required a different kind of patience entirely. Vael said nothing. She had not spoken since the morning briefing. The first 3 stages proceeded. Harwick shot well at 400, solid at 6, acceptable at 8, though his grouping spread slightly more than his expression suggested he expected. 3 other candidates dropped out at 800, not because they were ordered to, but because the math of the situation had become apparent to them and they respected the math. Kellner noted this without criticism. Knowing your limits was its own form of competence. That left 6 candidates standing at the 800-meter line when Kellner announced the 4th stage. Harwick stepped forward immediately. Vael stepped forward after a pause that was perhaps 2 seconds longer than anyone expected. The pause was not hesitation. It would become clear later that it was calculation, though no one recognized this at the time. The remaining 4 candidates exchanged glances and stayed where they were. Kellner looked at Vael. She was already looking at the tree line again. Not at the targets, not at Harwick. At the trees, watching them move. He understood then that she was reading the wind. Not with instruments. Not with the guesswork most candidates applied. She was watching the tops of the balsam fir at the target edge and comparing their movement to what she could feel at her position, working the difference into something usable. He had seen veteran snipers do this. He had seen it done badly, and he had seen it done well. He had not expected to see it done here, by this candidate, at this stage of the day. He said nothing. He had learned over 6 years that saying something in these moments usually cost you more than staying quiet. Harwick shot first. His round landed 112 centimeters right of center at 1,100 meters in a crosswind that had shifted 4 degrees clockwise in the previous 8 minutes. This was not a poor shot. At 1,100 meters in variable conditions, many experienced marksmen would have produced a worse result. Harwick seemed satisfied. He stepped back from the line with the expression of a man who had done the expected thing and expected to be recognized for it. Vael stepped to the line. She took longer than any of the observing candidates considered normal. She settled into position, adjusted twice, and then remained completely still for a period that Kellner later estimated at 47 seconds. During this time, the wind shifted again, dropped, actually briefly, the way it sometimes does in early morning over open flat ground before reasserting itself from a slightly different angle. Most shooters would have missed this or weighted it incorrectly. Kellner watched Vael and said nothing. Her round landed 11 centimeters right of center. This was not perfect. Perfect at 1,100 meters in those conditions would have required luck as much as skill, and Kellner had no interest in luck. What it was the product of a process, observable, replicable, grounded in something that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with the kind of methodical attention that selection was designed to find and almost never did. The laugh that had been circulating quietly through the observing group did not stop immediately. Laughter of that kind, the comfortable kind, the kind that has already decided the outcome, does not stop on a single data point. It requires accumulation. It requires the slow, uncomfortable process of evidence arriving in a form that cannot be explained away. The second round hit 9 centimeters right, adjusting for the resumed crosswind. The third hit 6 centimeters right. On the fourth round, in conditions that had not meaningfully changed, the grouping held. Kellner marked his clipboard. Nobody was laughing by then. They had not decided to stop. It had simply become structurally impossible to continue, and so it had stopped, the way certain things stop, not with ceremony, but with the quiet recognition that something has shifted. What came after that would take longer to describe, and in some ways it is the more important story. Linden Vael did not come from nowhere. The tendency to say that someone came from nowhere is a habit of narration that papers over the actual work. The years, the accumulation, the things a person carries forward into a room that looks to everyone else like a surprise. She came from Timmins, in the far north of Ontario, where the winters close in like compression, and the distances are large, and the people who stay learn certain things about stillness that people from elsewhere don't always recognize as skills. Her father, Grant Vael, had been a conservation officer for 22 years and a hunter for 35. He was not a demonstrative man. He expressed things through precision, through the careful construction of a duck blind, through the correct identification of a track, through the amount of time he was willing to spend without moving when the situation called for it. He taught his daughter these things not as lessons but as habits, because habits last and lessons often don't. She shot her first rifle at 11. She was not especially gifted at it. She was, at 11, ordinary in exactly the ways that cause adults to underestimate children. She was quiet, she made mistakes, she sometimes left the scope adjustment wrong and did not notice until after the shot. What she was, even then, was systematic. When she made a mistake, she went back to where the mistake had started, which is not what most people do. Most people will go back to the moment of the error. Linden went back to the moment before the error, to the decision that made the error possible. Her father noticed this when she was about 13 and did not say anything about it to her directly, because he understood that saying things directly often ruined them. She studied physics at Laurentian University in Sudbury because it was close, because the scholarship was available, and because the questions physics asked about force, about motion, about the behavior of objects moving through space and time were questions she had been asking informally for years. She was not a prodigy. She was, her second-year professor later noted, in a letter he would not write until much later, the most patient student he had encountered in 20 years of teaching, in the specific sense that she refused to accept an answer she did not fully understand. This quality frustrated people in the short term. In the long term, it produced a kind of competence that was difficult to shake. She joined the Canadian Forces at 23 because she wanted structure and because the signals work interested her. She was good at signals. She was exceptional, actually, though the metrics available to her unit were not well designed to capture the specific nature of her exceptionality. She processed complex acoustic data with the kind of facility that suggested she was hearing things that the instruments caught only partially, translating gaps and distortions into patterns that her supervisors sometimes treated as intuition, and she would have called, if asked, just doing the math properly. She had requested the JTF2 assessment twice before this. Both times she had been redirected, not denied outright, which would have required documentation, but redirected, which requires only a conversation. She understood what was happening. She understood it precisely, and without bitterness, which was perhaps its own form of advantage, because bitterness takes energy that can be used for other things. The third request had gone through. She was here. The range was 1,100 meters, and the trees were moving in a way that told her everything she needed to know about the next 8 seconds. The complication arrived 3 days after the range assessment in the form of Sergeant Kellner's superior, a man named Stratton who ran the JTF2 administrative evaluation process from an office in Ottawa and who had opinions about selection that predated most of the candidates currently in it. Stratton had reviewed Kellner's preliminary notes. He had concerns, which he expressed to Kellner by phone on a Thursday afternoon in the careful language of institutional concern, the kind of language designed to make subjective preferences sound like procedural requirements. He noted that the range assessment, while noteworthy, was a single data point. He noted that team integration was a critical component of selection. He noted that JTF2 operational requirements were specific and that the assessment process needed to reflect those requirements. He used the word requirements 4 times in a 12-minute conversation. Kellner wrote down what Stratton said and then put the notepad face down on his desk. He had been a sergeant for 11 years. He understood the machinery of institutional preference, how it moved, what it protected, what it was afraid of. He understood that what Stratton was actually saying was not about requirements. It was about the fact that Vael had outperformed a candidate from Stratton's previous posting, a candidate Stratton had personally put forward for selection, and that this outcome had produced a discomfort that needed to be managed. What Kellner did not yet know was what Vael herself was thinking about all of this. He had not spoken to her directly since the range assessment. He had observed her in the group exercises, quiet, functional, the kind of present that didn't demand attention but didn't disappear either. He had noted that she had not made friends within the candidate group, not precisely, though she was not unfriendly. She was occupied. She had the air of a person who is solving a problem continuously, in the background, beneath every other activity, the way some people carry music in their heads without being able to hear it from outside. He decided he needed to understand what she knew about what was happening. He found her at 18:30, at the edge of the range, standing in the last light with a small notebook in her hand. She was not writing in it. She was looking at the tree line. The notebook appeared to contain numbers. He stopped a few feet away and looked at what she was looking at. "Wind's changed direction since this morning," he said. 11 degrees, she said. "And the pressure's dropped about a kilopascal since 1400. Tomorrow morning's going to shoot long." He was quiet for a moment. "You're calculating tomorrow's conditions. It's useful to know what to expect." He looked at the notebook. The numbers were arranged in a structure he recognized. Not a table, not a list, but a kind of running calculation, each row building on the one above it in a way that tracked the progression of variables through time. Ballistic drift, Coriolis compensation, temperature correction applied to muzzle velocity. He had seen this kind of notation before in the workbooks of a master sniper he had trained under early in his career, a man who had spent 30 years learning to distrust his own instincts in favor of things he could verify. "Sergeant Kellner," Vael said, without looking up from the tree line, "is there something I should know about the administrative review?" He considered lying. It would have been the easier thing and the more comfortable thing, and it would have required almost no effort. A brief, reassuring sentence about standard procedure. The kind of sentence that is never quite a lie because it contains a technically accurate word or two, enough to stand behind if questioned later. He had used sentences like this before. They had served him adequately. They had also left a residue, the kind of residue that accumulates over years into something that changes the way a person looks at themselves in a mirror. "There are people," he said, "who find the results from Thursday inconvenient." She nodded. She had expected this. He could see that she had expected this. Not cynically, not with the posture of someone who has been waiting for confirmation of what they already knew, but pragmatically, the way a person processes information that fits into a pattern they have been tracking for some time. "The assessment isn't complete," she said. "No." "Then there's still data to be collected." "Yes." She looked at him for the first time. She had gray eyes that were difficult to read, not because they were flat, but because they were doing something that eyes rarely do, which is present information rather than performing emotion. She was not performing confidence. She was not performing resentment. She was simply present, in the specific way that people are present when they have decided that the moment they're in is the most important moment available to them. "I'd like to complete the assessment," she said. "I'd like that too," Kellner said. Neither of them said anything about Stratton. Neither of them needed to. The final assessment event was a scenario exercise conducted over 36 hours across mixed terrain northwest of the range facility, a combination of navigation, surveillance, and what the official documentation called problem resolution under incomplete information, which was a way of saying that the problem you were given at the beginning of the exercise was not the problem you would actually need to solve. Candidates were inserted individually at staggered intervals and given a set of coordinates, an objective, and a communications blackout that would last until the final 6 hours of the exercise. The objective, as stated, was to reach a designated observation point, establish a surveillance log of a simulated target, and extract without detection. The objective, as it actually operated, required each candidate to discover that the designated observation point had been compromised and to locate and use an alternative. The alternative position, known to the evaluators but not documented anywhere the candidates could access, was at a higher elevation with a more difficult approach and a narrower window for the observation task. Reaching it required a candidate to synthesize information from the environment rather than from instruction. Changes in wind pattern that indicated higher ground. Visual cues in the vegetation line, the angle of shadows at the time of insertion. Most candidates found the compromised position, recognized something was wrong, and then made decisions, some good, some poor, about what to do next. Vael was inserted third. She reached the compromised observation point at hour 7, assessed it in approximately 4 minutes, and moved directly to the alternative position without hesitation. This was noted on the evaluator's log. What was also noted, and what took the evaluator some time to fully process, was that she had not approached the compromised position from the expected direction. She had come in from the north, which added approximately 40 minutes to the approach, but eliminated 2 exposure windows that the exercise designers had considered unavoidable. She had seen them on the terrain map at the briefing and had apparently decided, in the time available, that they were worth avoiding at the cost of the extra time. The evaluator, a warrant officer named Crew, who had been running scenarios for 4 years and who was not easily impressed, wrote in his log, "Contritiant identified an approach the course designers had not considered. Suggest course revision." At hour 22, the communications window opened. Candidates were permitted to request clarification on a single element of the objective. Most used this to confirm the extraction point. 2 used it to request weather data. Vail requested the wind speed and direction at the alternative observation position for the previous 14 hours. When the communications officer relayed this request to the evaluation team, there was a brief silence. She was not at the observation position anymore by this point. She was on her extraction route, hours ahead of the projected timeline. She was requesting historical wind data for a position she had already left. She was, the evaluators eventually determined, building a retrospective calculation of how much her observations at that position needed to be corrected for wind-induced scope drift over the duration of her surveillance log. She had run the surveillance. She had kept the log. She wanted to know how accurate the log actually was, not as it appeared on paper, but as it corresponded to physical reality. The warrant officer Crew, when this was explained to him, put down his coffee and looked out the window at the white spruce for a long time. Then he picked up his radio and gave Vail the data she'd requested. The results of the 36-hour exercise were submitted to the selection board on a Friday morning. Kellner wrote his portion of the report the night before, in his office, with the door closed. He wrote it carefully, which for him meant writing it as accurately as he knew how, and then reading it back to himself once to check whether any sentence could be taken to mean something other than what he intended. He found 2 such sentences and revised them. The final report said, in the flat language of military assessment, that candidate Vail had demonstrated exceptional navigational judgment, above-average problem synthesis under incomplete information, and a performance at the long-range marksmanship stage that, in the evaluator's professional opinion, was not attributable to chance. Stratton read the report. Kellner received no phone call that day. He received no email. He received, the following Monday, a brief memorandum confirming that the selection board had completed its review and that results would be communicated to candidates within the standard time frame. Vail was informed of her selection on a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days after the range assessment. She was standing near the east end of the facility, not at the tree line this time, but at a table reviewing ballistic data with a kind of focused quiet that had, by this point, stopped surprising anyone who had spent time around her. Kellner delivered the notification himself, which was not required by procedure. It was not a long conversation. He told her she thanked him. She asked one question, which was whether there would be additional range time available during the integration phase. He told her he would look into it. She nodded. She did not ask what had happened with Stratton's concerns. She did not ask what the board had said or who had argued what. These were things that had happened on the other side of a wall she had never been able to see through. And she had learned long ago that spending energy on what you cannot see is a particular kind of waste, not because the invisible things don't matter, but because they resolve themselves, eventually, in response to the visible ones. What she had done was visible. What she had built, over years from a frozen range in Timmins and a physics classroom in Sudbury, and 100 quiet mornings, watching how the light moved across things that were moving themselves. That was visible if you knew what to look at. Kellner knew what to look at. He had spent 6 years learning how. The last evening before the integration phase began, Vail walked out to the north edge of the range facility after dinner. The balsam fir were dark against a sky that had gone deep blue, the stars coming in from the east the way they do in New Brunswick in autumn, gradually, and then all at once. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees since sunset. The wind had settled, finally, to something steady, coming clean from the northwest without gusting, the kind of wind you could calculate for, because it was, at last, being honest about what it was. She stood there for a while without her notebook. There was nothing to write down. The conditions were what they were, and tomorrow she would measure them properly, with proper instruments, in a controlled setting with proper time. But she looked at the trees anyway. Old habit. The trees moved the way they moved. A slight lean to the southeast that told her the wind was holding its direction. A shiver in the upper branches that told her the temperature gradient was stable, no fog coming, visibility good through the night and into the morning. The range was dark. The targets were not visible at this hour. They were out there somewhere in the Black North, at distances that were already familiar to her body, if not entirely to her mind. 1,100 meters. The number had meant something to a lot of people over the past 9 days, for a lot of different reasons. To Harwick, it had become a sore point, which she understood and didn't hold against him. Competitive people are injured by outcomes in ways that take time to heal, and he was a good soldier who had simply met a problem he hadn't previously considered. To Kellner, it had meant something more complicated, something he hadn't fully articulated to her, but that she had read in the way he stood at the range that morning, the way his pen moved when he marked the clipboard. To her, 1,100 meters was 1,100 meters. It was a distance. It had physics. The physics were knowable. You applied the variables correctly, in the correct sequence, and you accounted for what you didn't know by watching what the world told you if you were quiet enough to hear it. That was the whole of it. The wind held from the northwest, steady and clean, and the stars came in above the spruce, and she stood there in the dark at the edge of what came next, and the cold felt like the cold always felt in northern Ontario in her memory, not like an enemy, but like something honest, asking nothing from her except that she be accurate about what it was. She could do that. She had always been able to do that. She turned and walked back inside.